The pen was still wet when Damien Crosswell leaned across the table and said it. Not quietly, not with any attempt at decency. He said it loud enough for the clerk to hear, loud enough for the two paralegals standing near the door to freeze mid-step. Finally, he said, watching Elena sign her name for the last time. I can stop pretending I ever needed you. 7 years. She had given him 7 years, and that was his goodbye. Elena Voss set the pen down. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She simply looked at him the way you look at a stranger you realize you never actually knew, with something closer to exhaustion than anger. And she picked up the single suitcase she had packed that morning. One suitcase. That was all she had taken from a house that was supposed to be her home. If you had been standing in that hallway today, watching a woman walk away with nothing after giving a man everything she had, what would you have done? What would you have said? Before we go any further, if this story already has your heart beating a little faster, stay with us. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss what comes next. And drop a comment right now, son. Tell us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button. You have no idea what's coming. The divorce took 11 minutes. That was the part Elena couldn't stop thinking about as she pushed through the revolving glass doors of the Whitmore County Courthouse. 11 minutes. A marriage that had consumed the better part of her adult life, and a judge named Harold Briggs had dissolved it in the time it takes to drink a cup of coffee. She stood on the courthouse steps and breathed the November air. It was cold in a way that felt personal, the kind of cold that gets under your collar and stays there. The city of Crestfall moved around her the way cities always do. Indifferent, loud, completely unaware that someone's entire life had just been folded up and handed back to them in a manila envelope. She had a check in her purse. $42,000. That was what 7 years beside Damien Crosswell was worth, according to the settlement she had agreed to without a fight. Her lawyer, a nervous young man named Greer, who kept tugging his left cufflink, had begged her to push for more. Damien's assets were in the tens of millions. Elena could have walked away with a figure that would have made people's eyes water. She told Greer no. She told him she didn't want what wasn't freely given. Greer had looked at her like she had said something in a language he didn't speak. Behind her, through the glass, she could hear Damien's voice carrying down the corridor. He was already on the phone, already laughing. The sound had a particular quality to it, loose and self-congratulatory. The laugh of a man who believed he had just gotten away with something. She kept walking. The suitcase had wheels, but one of them was broken, and it dragged and skipped on the uneven sidewalk with a sound like a bad metronome. She hadn't noticed it when she packed. She'd grabbed the first bag she could reach, stuffed it with what mattered. A change of clothes, her mother's watch, 3 notebooks, her passport, and a folder of documents she had been quietly assembling for the past 8 months. And she had walked out of the Crosswell estate at 6:40 in the morning before the household staff arrived. She didn't leave a note. There was nothing left to say. The cab she'd called was parked half a block up. The driver was eating something wrapped in foil and reading a folded newspaper, and he startled a little when she knocked on the window. "Breckmore Arms," she said, "on 9th. The Breckmore Arms was not the kind of hotel that appeared in travel magazines. It was the kind of hotel that had a vending machine outside the ice room and carpet that had been shampooed so many times the pattern had disappeared. Elena had booked it 3 weeks ago under her maiden name, Voss, paid cash in advance, and told no one. It was the first decision she had made entirely for herself in 7 years. She was halfway to the cab when she heard Damien's footsteps on the courthouse steps behind her. "Elena?" She stopped. Not because she wanted to. Muscle memory, probably. 7 years of stopping when he called. She turned. He was standing at the top of the steps with his coat open and his hands in his trouser pockets. The stance he always used when he wanted to look relaxed but was actually calculating. His lawyer, a silver-haired man named Croft, stood 2 steps behind him pretending to check his phone. Damien looked at her suitcase. He looked at the broken wheel. And something moved across his face that she had learned over years to recognize. Not remorse, nothing so honest as that. It was the particular expression of a man who has just realized he's been seen being small. "You're really doing this," he said. "1 bag. Goodbye, Damien. You have nowhere to go." He said it without cruelty, which was almost worse. He said it the way you state a fact about the weather. "You've been out of the workforce for 4 years. You have no family in this country. Your degree is in art history, Elena. What are you going to do? She looked at him for a moment. Live, she said. Then she walked to the cab and got in, and did not look back through the window. She was not going to give him that. The cab pulled into traffic. Outside the window, Crestfall blurred past in its usual gray morning drag. Coffee shops and construction scaffolding and people hunched into their coats, moving from one place to the next. Normal. Ordinary. The city had no idea what she had just survived. Elena pressed her forehead against the cold glass and let herself feel it for exactly 60 seconds. The full weight of it. The loneliness and the relief and the grief that wasn't really about Damien. It hadn't been about Damien for years, but about the version of herself she had slowly, incrementally allowed to be worn away inside that marriage. Like stone in water, patient and invisible and total. 60 seconds. Then she sat up straight, opened the folder on her lap, and got back to work. The folder contained 14 documents. Most people who saw them would not know what they were looking at. To an untrained eye, they looked like financial records, columns of numbers, transfer receipts, corporate registration paperwork. To someone who knew what they were reading, they told a story about a man who had been moving money through shell companies registered in 3 different countries, using a network his wife had spent the last 8 months quietly and carefully mapping. Elena was not untrained. She had never told Damien this. She had never told anyone in Crestfall this, because the life she had built in this city was built specifically on not being known. But there was a version of Elena Voss that existed before Crestfall, before Damien, before the faded coat and the broken suitcase wheel and the 11-minute divorce. A version that had been carefully buried under a new name and a quiet life, and 7 years of a marriage she had chosen specifically because Damien Crosswell was the least dangerous man she had ever met. She had been wrong about that. She had been wrong about a lot of things. The cab stopped at a red light on Garrison Street, and Elena looked up through the window at a billboard advertising a luxury real estate development, Crosswell Holdings, in sleek gold letters. Damien's face smiled down at her from 40 feet in the air. She closed the folder. The Breckmore Arms smelled like industrial cleaner and the ghost of someone else's cigarettes. The woman at the front desk had acrylic nails in a color that matched nothing and gave Elena a key card without looking up from her screen. Room 244, second floor, end of the hall. The room was small and the bed had a synthetic comforter in a pattern of burgundy squares, and the window looked out onto the side of a parking structure. Elena set her suitcase on the luggage rack and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the wall for a while. Her phone had been ringing since she got in the cab. Not Damien. He was too proud for that. But his sister Renata had called 4 times. Renata was not cruel the way her brother was cruel. She was the softer kind of harmful, the kind who asks if you're okay in a tone that makes it clear she's hoping you'll say yes so she doesn't have to worry about it. Elena had spent years being gracious about Renata's gracious neglect. She didn't answer. She unpacked her 3 notebooks, her mother's watch, her passport. She placed them on the dresser in a line. Her mother's watch had stopped working 2 years ago. Elena hadn't gotten it repaired. She wore it anyway, most days, on her left wrist where a wedding band used to sit. Her mother had worn it every day of her adult life until the day she couldn't anymore. And when Elena held it, she could feel the particular weight of it that had nothing to do with its actual mass. Her mother's name had been Sylvia. Before she disappeared, she had told Elena 3 things she needed to remember. Trust slowly, leave nothing unfinished, and never let someone else decide what you are worth. Elena had been 22 years old when Sylvia told her these things. She had been standing in a kitchen that smelled like cardamom and coffee, and her mother had been looking at her with an expression she hadn't understood then. She understood it now. She set the watch on the dresser and opened the first notebook. Across the city, in the glass and steel tower that housed Crosswell Holdings executive offices, on the 31st floor, Damien was pouring himself a drink at 11 in the morning and telling his business partner, a compact, groomed man named Fletcher Ames, about the look on Elena's face when he'd spoken to her on the courthouse steps. She didn't even react, Damien said, with the tone of a man reporting a personal injury. I told her she had nowhere to go and she just looked at me, like I was nobody. Fletcher crossed one leg over the other. People process things differently. She wasn't processing, she was performing. Damien set his glass down harder than he meant to. 7 years I gave that woman a life. She lived in a 12-room house. She had a car and an account, and every social connection in this city came through me. She gave you something too, I'd imagine. Damien waved this off. She was a good wife, fine. She cooked. She showed up to dinners. She was... He trailed off, searching for the word. Adequate. Fletcher was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Where's she staying?" "No idea. Probably some second-rate hotel. She took $42,000 in the settlement. I thought she'd fight for more." Something crossed his face. "I thought she'd fight for something. And she didn't. She didn't fight for anything." He picked up his glass again. "Which means she either doesn't understand what she had, or she knows something I don't." Fletcher uncrossed his legs. "She's been your wife for 7 years, Damien." "I know." "You sure you know everything she learned in 7 years?" Damien looked at him. Then he laughed. The loose, self-congratulatory laugh Elena had heard through the glass. "She's an art history major from nowhere. She had no connections when I met her, no family, no money, no anything. She needed me." Fletcher said nothing. "She needed me," Damien said again, less certainly. His phone buzzed on the desk. He glanced at it. Unknown number. He let it ring. Then his assistant, a young woman named Petra, appeared in the doorway with an expression on her face that Damien had never seen her wear before. She was pale in a way that looked recent, like color had drained from her in the last few minutes. "Mr. Crosswell." Her voice was strange. "There's something happening outside." "I'm in a meeting, Petra." "Sir?" She stopped, swallowed. "You need to come to the window." The sound reached them before the sight did. A deep mechanical thrum that vibrated in the glass and in the furniture and in the bones of the building itself. Damien crossed to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked out over Crestfall and saw it. A helicopter. Black, military grade, with no visible markings. It was descending toward the courthouse complex 6 blocks away. Not circling, not slowing. Descending with the absolute certainty of something that has already decided where it is going to land. On the streets below, traffic had stopped. People were out of their cars. Even at this distance and this height, Damien could see the peripheral effects. Vehicles pulling to the curbs, pedestrians stopping mid-stride, the particular stillness of a city that has just had its ordinary rhythm interrupted by something it cannot categorize. "What is that?" Fletcher said from behind him. Damien's jaw was tight. "No commercial marking, private." "Landing at the courthouse?" "Rooftop." They watched. The helicopter touched down. Even at this distance, the precision of it was visible. The kind of landing that comes from a pilot who has done it 1,000 times in conditions far worse than a clear November morning in a mid-sized city. For 45 seconds, nothing happened. Then the rooftop door opened, and the men who came through it were not police, not security contractors, or rather, they were the kind of security that has no affiliation with any institution that files public reports. They fanned out across the rooftop with practiced, calibrated efficiency, and then the helicopter door opened and a single man stepped out. Damien could not see his face from 31 floors up and 6 blocks away. But he could see the cut of the suit, black, hand-tailored, the kind that costs more than most people's annual income. And the way the men around him organized themselves without being directed, the way iron filings orient to a magnetic field. "Who is that?" Fletcher said. Petra, still in the doorway, said very quietly, "The lobby is calling. They say there are 12 men in black vehicles on the street outside our building. They're not coming in. They're waiting." Damien turned from the window. Something in his chest had gone cold, but he didn't have a name for it yet. "Waiting for what?" Petra's phone buzzed. She looked at it. Then she looked up. "They say someone just walked out of the courthouse. A woman. With a suitcase." She paused. "The helicopter sent a car for her." The room was very quiet. "What woman?" Damien said. His voice came out steadier than he felt. Petra looked at him with the expression of someone who is already sorry for what they are about to say. "They say it's your ex-wife, Mr. Crosswell." Elena had been standing at the corner of 5th and Garrison for approximately 4 minutes, trying to remember which direction the cab had gone, because she'd realized she left her second notebook on the seat when the car appeared. Not a cab. Not anything she had called. A black vehicle, long and low and moving with the quiet authority of something that has never in its existence been hurried, stopped at the curb 10 feet from where she stood. The driver got out first, then another man from the passenger side. They were both large in the professional way. The kind of large that is not about muscle specifically, but about the particular combination of stillness and readiness that you feel before you register it consciously. The man from the passenger side walked toward her. He stopped at a respectful distance. "Ms. Voss," he said. Her name. Her real name. Not Crosswell. Not the name she had worn like a disguise for 7 years. Voss. She looked at the car. She looked at the man. She kept her face neutral with an effort she hoped did not show. "I think you have the wrong person," she said. "No, ma'am." The man was polite in a way that was not apologetic. "Mr. Valeri sends his regards. He asks that you allow him to provide transport." Elena set her broken suitcase down on the sidewalk. She had not heard that name in a very long time. She had in fact spent the better part of 6 years ensuring she would not hear it again. She had moved cities, changed her name, married a man who was safely connected to nothing that mattered, and built a life specifically designed to be invisible. And yet here was a man on a sidewalk in Crestfall saying Valerie with the calm certainty of someone who has never once considered that it might be the wrong word. "Tell Mr. Valerie I'm fine," she said. "Tell him I appreciate the thought." "He expected you might say that," the man said. "He asked me to tell you it's raining in about 15 minutes and that the suitcase wheel is broken." Elena looked down at the suitcase, then up at the sky. The clouds had the particular heavy gray of something that is already decided. She picked up the suitcase. She walked toward the car. The man opened the door for her, and she got in, and the car pulled smoothly into traffic, and Elena sat in the back seat with her folder on her lap, and her mother's watch on her wrist, and her face arranged into an expression that revealed absolutely nothing. Inside, she was calculating very fast. He had found her. After 6 years, he had found her, which meant either her cover had been compromised or he had simply never lost track of her. Both possibilities carried serious implications. She was running through them with the focused, methodical speed that some people are born with and most people spend their lives wishing they had, when the car turned not toward any hotel or private building, but back toward the courthouse, toward the rooftop. She looked out the window. The helicopter was still there, and standing near it, not sitting inside, not waiting in the warmth of some car, was a man in a black suit. He was standing in the cold because he had come outside to wait for her. She had not expected that. The car stopped. The driver came around and opened her door. Elena got out, and the cold hit her again, and she straightened her coat. The faded one, the practical one, the coat of a woman with $42,000 and one functional suitcase wheel. And she walked across the rooftop. He turned when he heard her footsteps. Cash and Valerie looked different than she remembered. Older, obviously. It had been 6 years. But it wasn't just age. The last time she had seen him, he had been bleeding through a wound in his side in the back room of a building she had no business being in, and she had cleaned the wound with what she could find and kept him awake through a night that could have gone the other way. And in the morning, he had been gone before she woke up. She had never known if he survived. She had told herself for 6 years that it didn't matter. He was not bleeding now. He was standing on a rooftop in Crestfall in a suit that cost more than her wedding ring had, and he was looking at her with an expression she recognized as something she had not allowed herself to think about in a very long time. He shrugged off his coat, heavy, black cashmere, and walked toward her and placed it over her shoulders. She let him. "You're cold," he said. "I'm fine." "You're always fine." Something moved in his eyes. "I know." They stood there for a moment, the coat around her shoulders, and the city spread out below them and the wind moving between them. Then his gaze moved past her, down, toward the street, toward the glass tower where she knew, with absolute certainty, Damien Crosswell was standing at a window right now watching this. 7 years ago, Cassian said, loud enough to carry, though she was not sure to whom. He had someone extraordinary beside him, and he spent 7 years making sure she forgot that. He looked back at her. His voice dropped. "I'm sorry it took me this long." Elena pulled the coat tighter around her shoulders. She looked at him. Then she looked down at the street, at the city, at the ordinary morning that had just been permanently altered. "You need to know," she said quietly, "that I didn't take anything when I left." "I know. I mean, I took what matters, What I spent 8 months building. She touched the folder under her arm. You need to know I'm not the same person you found 6 years ago. He almost smiled. Not quite. I know that too. The helicopter blades began to turn. Elena looked at it. Then she looked at the city. Then she made a decision that was not really a decision. It was the recognition of something that had already been made, somewhere in the arithmetic of the last 6 years. I need 2 stops, she said. I left a notebook in a cab, and I need to pick up my documents from a safety deposit box at the Garrison Street branch of First Meridian. Cassian nodded to one of his men. Then he turned back to her. And after that? Elena looked up at him. The coat smelled like something she didn't have a name for, expensive and cold, and faintly like the memory of a night she had spent 6 years not thinking about. After that, she said, we have a lot to talk about. Below them, somewhere in the glass tower on the 31st floor, she imagined she could feel Damien watching. She imagined the specific quality of his confusion, the way a man looks when the world rearranges itself around a woman he decided was worthless. She did not look down to check. She had spent 7 years looking down. She was done with that. The first notebook was gone. The cab company's dispatcher told Elena, over a phone that crackled with static, that Vehicle 44-1 had picked up 3 additional fares since dropping her at the Breckmore Arms, and that no notebook had been turned in to their lost and found office on Delancey. The woman on the phone said this with the particular flatness of someone who handles 50 such calls a day, and has long since stopped imagining the human weight behind any of them. Elena thanked her and hung up. She was sitting in the back seat of Cassian's car, a different one from before, a standard black sedan that drew no particular attention on the city streets, while 2 of his men waited outside the Garrison Street branch of First Meridian Bank. The safety deposit box was being retrieved. She had 7 minutes to think. The notebook she had lost was the earliest one, the one she had started 4 years into the marriage, when she first understood that what she was living inside was not a difficult marriage but a structured and deliberate diminishment. She had written in it carefully and specifically, not emotions, not grievances, but observations. Dates. Conversations recalled as precisely as she could manage. Behavioral patterns. The notebook had been her first tool and also her first act of resistance, and she had carried it out of the Crosswell estate that morning out of some instinct she could not name. Now it was in a cab somewhere in Crestfall, moving from fare to fare, and whoever found it would open it and see pages of a woman's careful handwriting cataloging the slow erosion of herself, and they would probably set it on a seat and forget it. She pressed her thumb against her mother's watch and made herself let it go. The car door opened. One of Cassian's men, the polite one from the sidewalk, whose name she had not yet been given, placed a sealed envelope on the seat beside her. Your documents, Ms. Voss. The box has been closed per your instructions. Thank you. He closed the door. She did not open the envelope. Everything in it she had already memorized. The physical copies were for the moment when memory was not enough, for the moment when someone looked her in the eye and said, "Prove it." That moment was coming. She could feel it the way you feel weather changing in a joint that was once broken. The car began to move. Through the tinted window, Crestfall scrolled past. She watched it with the disconnected attention of someone whose mind is operating on a different frequency than their surroundings, and she was doing the mathematics she should have done the moment she got off that rooftop. The mathematics of what Cassian's arrival meant, what it cost him, what he wanted, and how much of what she had built in the last 8 months would survive contact with the world he operated in. She was still running those numbers when the car turned onto the expressway, and she understood they were leaving the city. She knocked twice on the partition glass. It slid down. The driver, a man with a short neck and careful eyes in the rear-view mirror, looked at her. "Where are we going?" she said. "Mr. Valeries preferred to tell you himself, Ms. Voss. We'll be there in 40 minutes. Elena looked at the back of his head for a moment. Then she said, "Pull over." He hesitated. 1 beat, 2. "Ms. Voss, I'm not asking." Her voice had not changed in volume or temperature. "Pull over." The car pulled onto the shoulder. Elena sat forward. "I get in a car willingly. I agree to go somewhere willingly. Both of those things happened today, and I meant them both." She paused. "But I'm not a passenger. Do you understand the difference?" The driver looked at her in the rear view. He had the expression of a man recalibrating.
Yes, ma'am, he said. Tell me where we're going. The Harlan property, 40 miles north. It's Mr. Valerie's private estate. I know what it is. She sat back. Continue. The car pulled back onto the expressway. Elena looked out the window and let out a breath that she had apparently been holding for some time. She knew the Harlan property because she had made it her business, 8 months ago, to know everything about Cassian Valeri that was knowable from public and semi-public records, financial disclosures, property registrations, and the careful cross-referencing of sources that most people would not think to put together. She had done this not because she expected to ever see him again, but because knowing things was the only form of safety she had ever trusted. She had built that habit young. She had built it the way most survival skills are built, in response to a situation where survival was genuinely uncertain. Damian Crosswell's third call to Fletcher Ames went to voicemail. He stood at the window of his office and watched the city and felt the particular internal weather of a man who has just discovered that he has been operating on a fundamentally incorrect map. He had watched the helicopter leave. He had watched the black cars clear out from the street below his building with the coordinated efficiency of a military withdrawal. He had pulled up everything he could access on his phone about Cassian Valerie. And what was publicly available was extensive enough to be alarming, and what was publicly available was understood by everyone who read it to represent only the visible fraction of the actual picture. Damian was not a stupid man. He was an arrogant man, which is a different thing. And arrogance had the specific liability of making a person very good at reading situations where they had an advantage and very bad at reading situations where they didn't. He poured 2 inches of scotch and didn't drink it. The question that was eating him, the one he kept approaching and veering away from, like a man circling a fire to find the side that isn't burning him, was not why Cassian Valerie had come for Elena. The question was what Elena had been before she was his wife. What she had been before she walked into his life at a charity dinner in the 3rd year of his business expansion, wearing a gray dress and knowing nobody in the room, and he had genuinely thought, that he was doing her a favor by speaking to her. He had believed that for 7 years. He had constructed an entire architecture of belief around it. The scotch sat untouched. He picked up his phone and called someone who was not Fletcher. The call was answered on the 2nd ring. "I need a background check," Damian said. "Deep, not the surface stuff." "On who?" He hesitated over the word. It cost him something he didn't have a name for. "My ex-wife." Cassian was already at the Harlan property when the car arrived. He was standing in the main room, a space that was large without being ostentatious, furnished with the deliberate restraint of someone who has enough money that they no longer feel the need to demonstrate it. And he was on the phone. He ended the call when Elena walked in, which she noted. The room smelled like wood and cold air and something faintly chemical that she identified after a moment as fresh paint. Someone had recently done work on the north wall. She set her broken suitcase down and looked at him. He looked back. This was the 2nd time they had been in the same room in 6 years, and the courthouse rooftop had not quite counted, because there had been wind and helicopters and the performance of a gesture she was still calculating the meaning of. This was quieter. There was nowhere for either of them to look except at each other. "Sit down if you want," he said. "I'm fine standing." "I know." He said it the same way he'd said it on the rooftop. Not as an observation, but as something older than that. Something that had been carried a long time. "You can still sit down." She sat. The chair was leather and worn in a way that felt genuine rather than curated. She kept her coat on and her folder on her lap and her back straight. He sat across from her. He had loosened his tie. He looked, she thought, like a man who had been having a very long day that started long before this morning. "How did you find me?" she said. "I never lost you." She held that for a moment. That's not a comfortable thing to say to someone. "No." He didn't apologize for it. "I kept distance because you asked me to, but I kept track." He paused. "When I found out about the divorce, I decided the distance had served its purpose." "You decided?" "Yes." Elena looked at him with the focused attention she gave to things that required understanding rather than reaction. "Cassian, I left that life specifically. I left everything connected to it. I built something invisible and ordinary, and I lived inside it for 6 years. I know." "And you watched." "And I kept distance," he said again. "There's a difference." "The distinction is thinner than you seem to think."
He was quiet for a moment. She had the impression he was deciding something. Not what to say, but how much of what was true to say.
3 weeks ago, he said, someone inside my organization tried to put a file together on me. Historical associations. People connected to the period before the organization reached its current shape. He paused. Your name was in the preliminary report.
Elena went very still. Your real name, he said, Voss, connected to a location and a date that neither of us has discussed with anyone.
She looked at him. Who built the report? That's what I'm trying to find out. And you came here because whoever built it knows you exist, knows who you are, and knows what you meant to that period. His voice was even, but there was something underneath it that wasn't. They weren't going to stop at a report. The room was quiet, except for the sound of wind against the north wall where someone had recently painted over something. Elena opened the folder on her lap and removed a single sheet, a printout of financial movement she had mapped 3 weeks ago, tracing money through 4 shell companies into an account she had flagged for reasons she had not been able to fully articulate at the time. She held it out to him. He looked at it. Then he looked at her. Where did you get this? From Damien's records, she said. He thought I wasn't paying attention. I was always paying attention. Cassian studied the page. The account number at the bottom. She watched his eyes find it. She watched something happen in his face that was not quite surprise. It was the expression of a man who has just had a suspicion confirmed that he was hoping wouldn't be. You know that account, she said. It was not a question. Yes. Tell me. He set the page down on the table between them. He put his hands flat on either side of it, which was, she had noticed years ago, a physical habit he had when he was being honest about something difficult. It belongs to a man named Rowan Keel, he said. He's been with my organization for 11 years. He handles external communications and media positioning. I gave him considerable latitude. And Damien was paying him. It appears so. For how long? Cassian looked up from the page. Based on this trail, at least 14 months. Elena did the arithmetic. 14 months ago was 4 months before she had started building her folder, which meant someone had been building their own file on Cassian using Damien as a funding source while Elena was still inside that house, still waking up beside a man she had already stopped trusting, still performing the ordinary life she had selected specifically because it was supposed to be safe. He knew about me, she said. Not a question. Keel did. That's how Damien knew what questions to ask. Possibly. Not possibly. She was not angry exactly. Anger was too hot for what this was. This was the cold precision of understanding something you had hoped to avoid understanding. Damien never asked the right questions on his own. He's incurious by nature. Someone told him what to look for. Elena, don't. She said it quietly. Don't manage this. Just tell me what's true. He held her gaze. Keel may have had your name for up to a year before I saw the report. She absorbed this. And Damien may have known something about your background before the divorce proceedings were complete, which means the divorce was potentially accelerated by someone else's timeline, not just his. The afternoon light had shifted while they talked. It came now at a low angle through the western windows and caught the dust that the fresh paint had stirred, and the room looked briefly like something seen through water. Elena closed the folder. She had planned a great many things over the past 8 months. She had planned for the divorce, for the financial exposure, for the first 6 months of being alone and starting over. She had not planned for this. For the things she had buried 6 years ago to surface, not because of her own choices, but because someone had gone looking. Where's Keel now? She said. In the city, unaware that I've seen the report. You haven't confronted him. I wanted to understand the full shape of it first. He paused. I wanted to talk to you first. She looked at him. There was something in that sentence, in the particular weight of first, that she didn't respond to directly. Not yet. There were things between them that were real and old and had been deliberately set aside, and she was not ready to pick them back up until she knew how much danger she was standing in. What does Keel want? She said. To discredit me. To fracture the organization's structure before the Aldrin contract closes in 3 weeks. The contract is worth He stopped. It doesn't matter what it's worth. What matters is that it requires a unanimous show of organizational trust. If there's internal dissent visible before closing, it collapses. And Damien gets what out of this? Access to the secondary partners. Crosswell Holdings has been trying to enter that market for 3 years. Keel promised him an introduction in exchange for funding. Elena was quiet for a moment. She was thinking about Damien standing at the courtroom window. She was thinking about the 11-minute divorce and the $42,000 and the broken suitcase wheel and the fact that her ex-husband, who had spent 7 years deciding she was decorative and then disposable, had apparently been funding a campaign against the one person on Earth she had a genuine history with. The irony of it had a particular flavor she could not name. He didn't know, she said. Damien, he didn't know the connection. No, he knew I was someone you'd encountered, not the nature of it. Keel? Keel knows considerably more. She stood up. She moved to the window and looked out at the property. Bare trees, gray sky, a long gravel drive leading back to the road. Ordinary in the way that well-maintained private land always looks ordinary from the inside. Here's what I need you to understand, she said, not turning around. I came with you today because I chose to, not because I was out of options, not because Damien left me with nothing. She touched the folder under her arm. I came because you're the only person in this situation who I have reason to believe is telling me the truth. That's a low bar. Yes, she said. It is. She turned. I have everything that connects Damien to Keel's account. It's in here, and it's in 2 other places that have nothing to do with you. I built it because I thought it was about Damien's financial crimes. I didn't know it was pointing somewhere else. She looked at him steadily. I'll share it, but I need something in return. Name it. Full disclosure. Everything Keel has. Every file, every name, every piece of information that connects back to me. I need to know the full scope before we move. He was quiet. She recognized the quality of his silence. It was the silence of a man who is used to holding information as a form of control, confronting the specific discomfort of being asked to release it voluntarily. And if what you find in those files changes things, he said, then things change. She met his eyes. That's generally how information works. Something shifted in the room, not physically. Nothing moved. But there was a quality of agreement that settled between them the way things settle. When 2 people who have been careful with each other for a very long time finally decide to stop being quite so careful. His phone rang. He looked at it. His jaw tightened slightly. Not much, but enough. Keel, he said. Answer it, Elena said. He looked at her. Answer it, she said again. Let him think everything is normal. You have 3 weeks before the contract close. That's 3 weeks to find every thread and pull them in the right order. She paused. Don't let him hear anything in your voice. Cassian looked at her for one more moment. Then he answered the phone. Rowan. His voice was even, easy. The voice of a man who has nothing on his mind. What do you need? Elena listened to his half of the conversation and watched his face, and in the flat competence with which he managed it, the slight strategic warmth, the casual deflection, the entirely convincing performance of a man who is not aware he's being maneuvered, she recognized something she had not allowed herself to think about since a night 6 years ago in a building she had no business being in. She recognized someone who was very good at surviving. The call ended. He set the phone on the table. He wants a meeting tomorrow morning, Cassian said. Said there's a development in the Aldrin positioning he needs to walk me through. He's accelerating. Yes. Because of today. She said it with the flat certainty of someone arriving at a conclusion. He saw the rooftop. He saw the cars. He's recalculating. It was visible. You made it visible on purpose. He didn't answer immediately, which was an answer. You wanted him to move, she said. You knew that if he thought you were distracted or vulnerable or that something had shifted in your orbit, he'd accelerate. And an accelerated man makes mistakes. A man who knows he's running out of time makes mistakes, Cassian said. That's the same thing. Is it? Elena looked at him. You used today. You used me. No. His voice lost the even quality for the first time. I did not use you. I came to get you off a courthouse step with a broken suitcase on the worst morning of your last 7 years. Both things can be true simultaneously. He paused. I will not apologize for thinking ahead. She held his gaze. There was something she wanted to say, something about the difference between being protected and being positioned, about the fact that she had spent 7 years as someone else's variable in someone else's calculations. And she was not available for that again, regardless of who was doing the calculating. She didn't say it. Not yet. There was a hierarchy to what needed to be addressed, and that was further down. The meeting tomorrow, she said. What does he expect from it? He expects to brief me on a communications strategy, probably to gauge how much I know or suspect. He'll read you. He's been reading me for 11 years. He thinks he knows all my tells. Does he? Cassian almost smiled. He knows the ones I showed him. Elena thought about this. The light had gone entirely flat now, the afternoon collapsing into early dusk the way November afternoons do, without announcement. One of Cassian's men appeared in the doorway briefly, caught Cassian's eye, and retreated. The household, if it could be called that, was operating around them with the quiet of trained discretion. I want access to Keel's files tonight, she said. Whatever your people can retrieve without flagging his awareness. I can have it arranged in 2 hours. And I want to be in the building tomorrow when he comes. Cassian looked at her. Not visible, she said. I'm not interested in a confrontation. Not yet. I want to hear how he talks to you when he thinks the room is just the two of you. People tell you everything when they think they're controlling the conversation. You've done this before, he said. It was not quite a question. She did not answer. She picked up her broken suitcase and looked around the room with the efficient assessment of someone deciding what they're working with. Which direction is the room I'm in? She said. He stood and led her down a corridor. He showed her the room. Simple, clean, a window that faced east. He set her suitcase on the luggage rack inside the door and did not comment on the broken wheel. She appreciated that. At the doorway, he stopped. Elena. She turned. The night I left, he said. Before you woke up. He was looking at the floor, then up. I left because staying would have been dangerous for you, not because... He stopped. Something in his face worked briefly. I need you to know it wasn't because the alternative didn't occur to me. The corridor was quiet between them. It occurred to me too, she said. That's not the same as it being a good idea. He nodded. He stepped back from the doorway. She closed the door. She stood with her back against it in the dark room for a moment, and she breathed the cold air coming through the window seam, and she thought about Damien somewhere in the city right now, making calls he didn't understand were already too late, and Rowan Keel arranging a meeting he thought gave him the advantage, and a file somewhere with her real name on it. She thought about her mother's watch, not working, sitting on a dresser in a hotel room she had already checked out of in her head. She put the folder on the narrow desk by the window and turned on the lamp. She opened it to the first page. She got to work. 3 miles away, in the back seat of a car moving through the Crestfall evening traffic, Damien Crosswell received the preliminary results of the background check he had ordered. The investigator had flagged it urgent. Damien read it once. Then he read it again. His hand, holding the phone, was not quite steady, and when his driver glanced in the rearview mirror at the sudden silence from the back seat, Damien did not notice. He was looking at a name. Not Crosswell. Not the name of the woman he had divorced that morning. The name his investigator had found underneath all of it, at the bottom of a record that should not have been accessible, from a family that should not have existed as far as Damien's world was concerned. And beside that name, in the investigator's notes, active file. Current interest from multiple parties. Do not proceed without full legal cover. Damien put the phone face down on the seat beside him. He looked out the window at the city he had spent his life building himself into, at the buildings with his name on them, and the people who used his connections and owed him favors, at the infrastructure of importance he had constructed brick by brick over 20 years. He thought about Elena. He thought about the way she had looked at him on the courthouse steps. Not with anger, not with grief. With the particular expression of someone who has already finished mourning something and moved on to the next thing. He had thought she was performing composure. He understood now, with the cold and clarifying effect of information he could not unknow, that she had not been performing anything. She had been waiting. He picked up his phone and called Fletcher Ames again. This time, Fletcher answered. We have a problem, Damien said. Define it. Elena. He stopped. The word felt different now. She's not who I thought she was. Fletcher was quiet for 3 seconds. Damien, what did you do? I started a background check. You started a... Fletcher's voice went tight. Who did you use? Hartley's people. Hartley reports to 6 different clients. You know that. If he flagged it urgent, the flag went to everyone on his list. Fletcher's voice had this quality of a man looking at a crack in a dam. What exactly came back? Damien told him the name. The silence on the other end lasted long enough that Damien checked the screen to see if the call had dropped. Fletcher. Get off the road, Fletcher said. Go somewhere private. Don't use your regular driver. A pause. And Damien, do not call anyone else tonight. Not Keel, not your lawyer, no one. Why? Because you just put a flag on a name that has been inactive for 6 years, Fletcher said. And the people who've been waiting for that name to surface are now going to know someone is looking. The car moved through the evening traffic. The city lights came on around them, one by one, in the way they always did. Indifferent and ordinary, and completely unaware that something had just shifted in the specific, invisible architecture of cause and effect that determines how things fall. What do I do? Damien said. His voice had lost its usual quality. It sounded like what it was, a man who has just realized he stepped onto ice he thought was solid and heard it give. Tonight, Fletcher said, nothing. Sit still. Don't move, don't call, don't drink any more of whatever you've been drinking. Another pause. And start thinking about who else might have already known what you just found out. Because I promise you, you are not the first person who went looking tonight. The call ended. Damien sat in the back of the car as it moved through the city, the phone in his hand, and the investigator's report face down on the seat beside him. And for the first time in a very long time, he felt something he had not felt since before the money, before the tower, before the empire. He had spent his life assembling one careful piece at a time. He felt afraid. And somewhere in a room 40 miles north, Elena Voss turned a page in her folder and kept working, because she had always understood what Damien was only beginning to learn, that the most dangerous moment is not when things fall apart. It is the moment just before, when everything still looks like it's standing, and the people who can already see the shape of what's coming have quietly, carefully, made sure they are standing somewhere else when it does. The files arrived at 2:47 in the morning. Elena had not slept. She had not tried. She was sitting at the narrow desk with the lamp on its lowest setting, working through the second half of her folder with the focused, methodical attention of someone who has learned that exhaustion is negotiable but errors are not. When the knock came, 2 quiet raps, then 1, the pattern she had been told to expect. She opened the door. The polite man whose name she still did not know handed her a flat black drive the size of a thumb and said, 16 months of internal communications, external correspondence flagged by keyword, financial routing for his personal accounts, parallel to organizational accounts. He paused. Mr. Valeri says to tell you the meeting is confirmed for 9 tomorrow morning. Today, she said. It was already tomorrow. Yes, ma'am. She took the drive. She closed the door. She sat back down at the desk and plugged it into the laptop that had appeared on the desk sometime in the past 2 hours. She hadn't asked. It had simply materialized, which told her something about how this household operated. She opened the first folder. Rowan Keel was, on paper, a careful man. His communications were precise and largely clean, the kind of correspondence that has been written by someone who knows that everything leaves a trace and has therefore cultivated a habit of saying almost nothing in writing. Most of his flagged messages were oblique enough that they could mean several things simultaneously, and Elena recognized the discipline behind them the way you recognize a skill in someone who has been practicing it a long time. But careful men have one consistent liability. They trust the people they trust completely. She found it at 4:12 in the morning in a subfolder of personal messages that had been sent from a private account Keel apparently believed was unconnected to anything organizational. The messages were to a single recipient identified only by an initial, M, and they covered a period of 11 months. She read them in order. By the 5th message, she had stopped blinking. By the 12th, she had stood up from the chair and walked to the window and stood there with her hand flat on the glass and the cold coming through it and her heart doing something she could not immediately regulate. She went back and read the 12th message again. The V woman is the key. Once we have documentation of her real identity and her connection to CV's pre-organization period, We don't need anything else. The Aldrin partners won't touch him. No one will. Use the husband while he's still useful. He has no idea what he's actually funding. When it's done, cut him. She read it again. Then she read the message dated 6 weeks after that one, and her hand on the glass curled into something that was not quite a fist. M confirmed the identity. She's been living as Crosswell's wife for 5 years at this point. Ironic that he married the one person who could destroy us both and treated her like furniture. Confirms what I always thought about men like him. They can't see what's in front of them. We'll proceed. Elena stood at the window for a long time. Outside, the property was dark and still. No wind. The bare trees stood in the blackness with the motionless patience of things that have learned to wait without suffering. She was doing something she almost never allowed herself to do, which was feel things in real time without filtering them first. The anger was there, specific and cold, not hot. Nothing about this registered as hot. But underneath it was something older and more destabilizing. The understanding that the life she had built with such care, with such deliberate invisibility, had not been invisible at all. That someone had known, had been watching, had been using, for 11 months before the divorce, possibly longer. She took her hand off the glass. She went back to the desk and kept reading. The recipient, M, did not appear by full name anywhere in the correspondence. But people who trust each other make references to shared history, to places, to mutual connections. And Elena had been trained by years and necessity to build pictures from fragments. By 5:30 in the morning, she had a shape. She did not have a name yet, but she had a shape, and a shape was enough to start. She pulled out a blank page from her folder and began to write. Cassian was in the kitchen at 6 when she came downstairs. He was standing at the counter with a cup of coffee and his jacket off and his sleeves rolled, and he looked like a man who also had not slept, though he had made efforts. His face was recently washed. His posture was deliberate in the way that posture becomes deliberate when the body underneath is running on nothing. He looked at her when she walked in. He looked at the page in her hand. "Show me," he said. She set the page on the counter between them. She had written 12 points in order, each one sourced to a message number from the drive. She had also written, at the bottom, the shape she had assembled, the profile of M. Without a name, but with enough that the name should follow. He read it. He read it twice. He did not say anything. "The husband was incidental," Elena said. "Keel didn't cultivate Damien because of his resources. He used him because Damien had access to me. Whatever Damien told him, things he'd noticed about me, questions I'd asked, places I'd been, all of it fed back to Keel and then to M." She paused. Damien didn't know what he was providing. He thought it was a business arrangement. He still provided it. "Yes." Cassian set the page down. He picked up his coffee and held it without drinking. "The shape you've built here." He touched the bottom of the page. "The age range, the institutional connection, the pattern of using intermediaries in pairs." He was quiet. "I can name 2 people it could be." "Tell me." He set the cup down. "Marlena Voss." The name landed in Elena's chest like something dropped from a height. She did not move. She did not change her expression. She was very, very still in the way that people who have been taught, formally, specifically, to manage physiological response under pressure are still. But her hands, which were flat on the counter, pressed harder against the surface, and that she could not help. "Say it again," she said. Her voice was someone else's. "Marlena Voss." He was watching her the way you watch someone when you're not sure whether what you're about to do is going to save them or destroy them. "She's your mother's sister, younger by 4 years. She took over the family's secondary network after what happened to your parents. She's been operating under 3 different identities since then." He paused. "Elena, don't." Her voice was flat. "Don't say my name right now in that tone. You need to hear this." "I heard it." She stepped back from the counter. She turned and looked at the window over the kitchen sink. Gray early light, the trees visible now as shapes rather than blackness. "My aunt." "Yes." "Who I have not had contact with since I was 22 years old." "Yes." "Who I was told, specifically and by people I had reason to believe, had been out of the country for the past decade and operating entirely outside the family's original sphere." That information was incorrect. Elena turned back around. No, she said. That information was planted. There's a difference. He said nothing. She wanted me to believe she was gone, Elena said. She fed that information to the people who were protecting me, which means she had access to... She stopped. The full topology of it was assembling itself in her mind with a speed that was almost physical. She knew my location, not just now. She knew where I was when I was with Damien. She knew before that. She's known the entire time. It appears so. And she sent Keel. Based on your profile, yes. Not to destroy you, Elena said. She heard her own voice from a slight distance. To get to me. Through you. The kitchen was quiet. Somewhere in the house, something settled. The wood or the pipes, some small mechanical accommodation of temperature. She wants the documentation, Elena said. The original documentation, from before. She looked at Cassian. She thinks I have it. Do you? Elena looked at him for a long moment. My mother gave me something, she said, before she disappeared. I was told it was personal, letters, photographs. She stopped. I've never opened the case. Cassian's expression shifted slightly. It's in a storage facility, Elena said, in a city I lived in before Crestfall, before Damien. She looked at him. If Marlena knows what's in it, she has a reason I don't yet understand to need it back. Where is the facility? She told him. He pulled out his phone. Wait. She put her hand on his arm. He stopped. Not yet. Because if she's been watching me for 6 years, she may have that facility under observation. If we move on it before we know her full position, we tip her. She removed her hand. Keel's meeting is in 3 hours. We learn everything we can from that first. He put the phone down. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Not admiration exactly, but something adjacent to it that also contained the specific sorrow of a person watching someone else carry weight they should not have to carry. She's family, he said. It was not an accusation. It was an acknowledgement. She stopped being family a long time ago. Elena picked up her page from the counter and folded it. She just didn't tell me. Keel arrived at 8:57. Elena was in a room 2 doors down from Cassian's study, a small sitting room with the door cracked 2 inches, enough for sound to travel clearly in the wood-floored corridor. She sat in the chair nearest the door with her eyes closed and her hands in her lap and listened the way she had learned to listen a very long time ago, not for words but for the space between words, for the rhythms of breath and pause that tell you what the words are working to conceal. She heard Keel's voice for the first time. He was younger than she'd expected from the profile. Or his voice was younger, warm and considered, with the easy authority of someone who has been trusted for so long that trust itself has become his natural environment. He greeted Cassian with the comfortable familiarity of a man who has sat across from the same person for 11 years and believes he knows every angle of them. Aldrin's people reached out yesterday, Keel said. They're nervous about the timeline. I told them the close is solid. Is it? Cassian's voice was even, perfectly even. As far as I'm aware. A brief pause. You have concerns. Always have concerns at this stage. That's not unusual. No. A shift. The sound of someone settling into a chair. How are you feeling about the rest of the week? You had some activity yesterday. Activity? The courthouse. It was visible. Keel said it with practiced neutrality, the tone of a man raising a concern in the mode of collegial observation. Some of the external contacts are asking questions. Let them ask. It may complicate the Aldrin positioning if it looks like personal matters are... Rowan! Cassian's voice changed very slightly. Not enough for a stranger. Enough, Elena thought, for a man who had worked alongside him for 11 years. It's handled. A pause. The woman is... handled, Cassian said. Move on. She could hear Keel recalibrate, the tiny auditory adjustment of a person whose probe has been deflected and is now deciding how much pressure to apply directly versus laterally. Of course. He moved on. He presented the Aldrin communications strategy in 15 minutes of clean, organized briefing. Professional, thorough, largely genuine, Elena thought. His competence was not performed. That was important to understand. He was good at his work and had been good at it for 11 years, and the betrayal running beneath it did not negate the surface. Both things were real simultaneously. When the briefing ended, there was the usual procedural winding down of such meetings, papers gathered, minor scheduling confirmations. And then Keel said, in the same collegial tone he'd used throughout, "One more thing. I may need to take personal leave next week. Family matter in Westport." Elena opened her eyes. Westport, the city she had lived in before Crestfall, the city where a storage facility held a locked case she had carried for 6 years without opening. She was on her feet before she had consciously decided to stand. She was in the corridor before the sitting room door had fully swung open behind her. She walked the 2 doors down. She put her hand on the study door. She stopped. Through the door, she could hear Cassian say, "Of course. Whatever you need." His voice still perfectly level. She waited. She heard the sound of a second chair moving, feet on the floor. The meeting was ending. She stepped back from the door and pressed herself against the corridor wall and stood there while the study door opened and Rowan Keel walked out. He was 40, maybe 42. Medium height, dark hair going silver at the temples. A face that was pleasant in the practiced way that faces become pleasant when pleasantness is professionally useful. He had his briefcase in his left hand. He was looking at his phone. He looked up. He saw her. For exactly 2 seconds, nothing happened. She watched his face. She watched it do the thing that faces do when the mind behind them is running very fast while the surface tries to remain still. She watched him look at her and understand. Not everything, but enough. She could see it in the way his breathing changed, the way his weight shifted slightly onto his back foot. "Ms. Voss," he said. His voice was almost perfect. Almost. "Mr. Keel." Hers was. Cassian appeared in the study doorway. He looked at both of them with an expression that was, in this moment, completely unreadable. Keel's eyes moved to Cassian, then back to Elena. In that movement, she saw the calculation. He was deciding whether this was deliberate or coincidental, whether she was a variable he had been prepared for or a variable that had just appeared outside its expected parameters. "I didn't realize you had a guest," he said to Cassian. "She arrived this morning," Cassian said, which was technically true of today, and she understood why he said it that way. Keel looked at her for a moment longer. She held his gaze with the specific blankness of someone who is letting the other person do all the interpretive work. "Safe travels," she said. He nodded once. He walked toward the front of the house. They listened to his footsteps, then the door, then the sound of a car engine starting and the tires on the gravel drive. Cassian looked at her. "You heard." "Westport," she said. "I heard it too." "He's going for the case." "Yes." "Which means Marlena already knows where it is. She told him." Elena turned. She walked back toward the study. Cassian followed. She stood in the middle of the room and turned to face him. "We have 48 hours. If he gets on a plane tonight and reaches the facility before us, whatever's in that case goes to Marlena, and we lose the only leverage that could—" She stopped. "Could what?" Cassian said. She looked at him. She was doing the arithmetic again, fast and cold, and one of the numbers in the calculation was something she had been avoiding adding to the equation because its presence changed everything downstream. "My mother didn't disappear," she said. The room was very quiet. "Elena, she was removed." She said it the way you say things when you have been not saying them for so long that the saying of it is almost physical. "I was told it was connected to the family's exposure, that multiple people had been taken, that it was broad and chaotic, and she was one of several—" She stopped. "But that's not what happened, is it?" Cassian was looking at her with the expression of a man who has been carrying something alongside someone who didn't know he was carrying it. "Tell me," she said. "Right now. All of it." He sat down. He put his hands on his knees. He looked at the floor for 3 seconds, and then up at her, and she saw on his face the specific quality of a man who made a decision about what to protect and when, and is now arriving at the moment he knew eventually he would have to arrive at. "Your mother's disappearance was not random," he said. "It was coordinated by someone inside the family structure who had identified her as the primary holder of documentation, records she had been compiling for years on the organization's financial architecture, partnership networks, and what she called the contamination." He paused. The contamination was the term she used for people inside the family's trust circle who had been turned. Turned by whom? By an outside party with a long-term interest in the family's infrastructure. He looked at her. "Your aunt was not turned, Elena. She was the one doing the turning."
The room did not change. The light did not change. Elena's face did not change. But something happened in her chest that was tectonic, old and deep, and involving the movement of things that had been fixed in place for a long time. "She took my mother," Elena said. "She arranged it. She didn't do it personally." "Where is she?" "We don't—" "Where is my mother?" Her voice had not risen. It was, in fact, quieter than before. The particular quiet that sits at the bottom of things. Cassian held her gaze. "We believe she is alive. There are indicators, recent indicators, that she's been held in a location connected to Marlena's current primary operation." He paused. "That is why the documentation matters. Your mother built records that would expose Marlena completely. Marlena has spent 6 years trying to locate them. The case your mother gave you is the proof," Elena said. "She gave it to me because I was the one person Marlena might not immediately target, the youngest, the one who disappeared into an ordinary life." She sat down. The chair was behind her and she found it without looking. "My mother sent me away with the evidence and let me think it was a box of letters. She was protecting you. She was protecting the evidence and using me to do it." Elena looked at the ceiling, then at the floor, then at her hands. "She's been in a room somewhere for 6 years while I was married to a man who thought I was decorative. I was worried about a notebook I left in a cab." "You didn't know?" "I didn't know." She stood back up. She could not sit. Her body had too much current running through it. "Keel is going for the case tonight. If he gets it first, Marlena has the evidence and a reason to remove the only people who know what it contains." She looked at Cassian. "Which is us." "Yes." "We need to go to Westport. I have a plane. Now. The car's outside in 6 minutes." Elena looked around the room. The laptop, the folder, the page with her 12 points, and Marlena's shape at the bottom. She moved to the desk and took everything. She did not leave the drive. She put it in her coat pocket, and she picked up the folder and she looked at Cassian. "One more thing," she said. "When we find what's in that case, when we have it in our hands, we do not use it on our timeline. We use it on hers." She met his eyes. "I want her to know it was me." He looked at her. 6 hours ago, you were calculating whether to trust me with your file. 6 hours ago, I didn't know she had my mother." Elena moved toward the door. "The calculation has changed." "What?" "The plane was a small private aircraft, 8 seats, a pilot, and 1 attendant who disappeared into the front cabin without being asked. It lifted into the Crestfall morning at 8:40 with Cassian's phone pressed to his ear and Elena beside him with her folder open on the fold-down tray, reading the messages again with the specific attention of someone who is now looking for something different than they were looking for the first time. She found it on the 3rd pass. Message 19, sent 7 months ago from Keel to M. She had read it before and moved past it because its first half was procedural, scheduling, logistics. But the second half, which she had read as filler, now read entirely differently. The C situation remains stable. He has no idea the timeline is not his. When V leaves him, and she will leave him, she's been compiling something for months, I can see it in the pattern. The departure will trigger the retrieval window. She'll go to Valerie. She has nowhere else with the context to go. And when she does, it activates the protocol. Elena read the last sentence again. When she does, it activates the protocol. She looked up from the page. Outside the small window, Crestfall had already fallen away below them. They were above cloud cover, in the particular white nothing of altitude. "Cassian," she said. Her voice was very calm. "I need you to tell me what the protocol is." He was still on the phone. He looked at her. Something in her expression made him end the call. "What protocol?" he said. She turned the laptop toward him. She pointed to the sentence. He read it. She watched his face. She watched the moment he understood, not the words. He had understood the words immediately. The moment he understood the implication. "They wanted her to come to me," he said. "They engineered it," Elena said. "The divorce wasn't just Damien's decision. The timing was managed. Keel created conditions inside your organization that would become visible right when I left. The Aldrin contract pressure, the internal tension, the report with my name. All of it calibrated to ensure that when I surfaced, I would surface directly to you. And when I did..." She stopped. "The protocol activates." "What protocol?" "I don't know yet,
But it's not about the case. She looked at him. The case is what Marlena wants. The protocol is what she needs. And the difference between what someone wants and what they need tells you where their actual vulnerability is. She closed the laptop. She needs something to happen between us. Something that requires us both to be in the same location, moving toward the same object. She looked at him steadily. She's not trying to retrieve evidence, she's trying to get us in one place. The plane moved through white nothing. Cassian was very still. She could see him processing, reorganizing, the way a mind that operates in high-stakes environments reorganizes when new information requires structural revision of everything that came before. The storage facility, he said, is almost certainly a controlled location. Elena looked at her hands, then up. She's had 6 years to prepare it. Keel is not going there to retrieve the case. He's going to open a window. She paused. We're the ones expected to walk through it. The attendant appeared briefly with water and retreated. Outside, the white nothing continued. Elena set the folder down on the tray. She pressed her fingers against her mother's watch. Still, always still. And she sat with the full weight of what she now understood, that the life she had built had not been invisible, that the 6 years she had spent believing she was hidden had been 6 years of being carefully, deliberately kept in place, that the woman who had arranged all of it was the woman she had grown up being told to trust after her mother could no longer be trusted too. She thought about her mother in a room somewhere. 6 years. She thought about what 6 years looks like from the inside of a room you cannot leave. She picked up the folder. She opened it to the blank page at the back. She began to write. Cassian watched her for a moment. "What are you doing?" he said. "Changing the plan," she said. "Because she built the plan we were following, and I will not walk through a door that someone else opened for me." She did not look up. "We're not going to the storage facility. Then where?" "We're going to Westport," she said, "but not for the case." She finished writing. She looked up. Her eyes had the quality of something that has been through a long cold and come out the other side into something harder and clearer and less forgiving. "We're going because she'll be there. Because she can't send Keel for something this significant without being proximate. She has to know it worked." Elena held his gaze. "And I'm going to let her believe it did." Cassian looked at her for a long moment. "You're going to walk into it," he said, "on purpose." "I'm going to walk into it differently than she expects." Elena set the pen down. "There's a version of me she's been watching for 6 years. The careful one. The one who disappears and survives and does not make aggressive moves." She looked at him. She's never met the other version. The plane banked slightly, and below the cloud cover Crestfall had vanished entirely, and the only thing visible was white in every direction. And Elena sat in her seat with her folder on her lap and her mother's watch on her wrist, and the expression on her face of someone who has just finished being afraid and started being something else entirely, something that did not yet have a name, but was already moving. Westport was a gray city in the way that port cities are gray, not from weather specifically, but from the accumulated residue of industry and salt water and decades of commerce that never fully washes clean. It sat on the edge of a bay that smelled like diesel and cold metal, and its streets had the particular texture of places that have been useful for a long time without ever being beautiful. The plane landed at a private airfield 20 miles outside the city at 11:40 in the morning. There was a car waiting. There was always a car waiting, Elena had begun to understand, in Cassian's world. Not because anything was lavish, but because preparation was the only form of control available to a person who operates in environments where control is perpetually contested. She did not sleep on the plane. She worked. By the time they landed, she had written 4 pages in the back of her folder and reread Keel's messages 3 more times, and constructed what she believed was a sufficiently accurate model of Marlena's operational logic to know where the pressure points were. She had also accepted, somewhere over the cloud cover between Crestfall and Westport, that she was afraid. Not of Marlena specifically. Not of what the case contained or didn't contain. She was afraid of what it would feel like to be right. To walk into a building and find her mother the way you find something you have spent years telling yourself might be gone. The anticipation of that particular feeling was its own form of damage, and she set it aside with the efficiency of someone who knows that feelings do not disappear when you set them aside, but can be managed sequentially, and this one would have to wait. The car moved through Westport's morning traffic. Cassian sat beside her with his phone and said very little. She had outlined the approach on the plane, and he had listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. And then he had asked two questions, both precise, both indicating that he had processed the plan accurately. And then he had made calls. She didn't listen to the calls. She trusted that the logistical layer was being handled. Her attention was on the layer underneath. The facility is on Crandon Street, she said. Industrial block 6 blocks from the water. I rented the unit 4 years ago under a name I've never used in Crestfall. Does Marlena have that name? Unknown. She has the location, Keel said Westport, and the facility is the only thing I have in Westport, but the unit number is indexed under the alias. She looked out the window. She may have it. She's had 6 years and she's not careless. So we assume she has it. We assume she has everything. Elena turned from the window. That's the only posture that doesn't get us killed. Cassian looked at her without expression. Then he nodded. The car turned onto a street that ran parallel to the waterfront, and Elena felt the city settle around her with the particular weight of a place she had been before. Not comfortably, but specifically. She had lived in Westport for 8 months, 5 years ago, before moving to Crestfall. She had walked these streets and eaten in these coffee shops and kept entirely to herself, and the city had accommodated her the way port cities accommodate everyone, without curiosity, without welcome, without hostility. Just presence. We have a problem, Cassian said. She looked at him. He was looking at his phone. Keel boarded a flight at 7:15 this morning. He landed in Westport 40 minutes ago. She calculated. He's already at the facility. Or en route. He's there. She said it with certainty because the math of it was certain. Keel had left the Harlan property, driven to an airport, boarded the first available flight, and was now 40 minutes ahead of them in a city where the storage facility was the only meaningful destination. He's there and Marlena knows we're coming because Marlena has known every move we were going to make before we made it. She looked at her hands. Except this one. You sure about that? She was not sure about that, but certainty and performance of certainty were sometimes the same instrument, and this was one of those times. We're not going to the facility, she said. We go to her. We don't have a confirmed location. We have enough. She opened the folder and removed the last page she'd written on the plane, the profile, the shape. The operational pattern is consistent across all of Keel's messages. She doesn't use commercial properties. She doesn't use anything with a documented rental history. She uses residential, private, short-term, owner-occupied, or owner-adjacent. She pointed to a line. Keel mentions Westport twice in the correspondence before last week. Once 14 months ago, a meeting. Once 8 months ago, a follow-up. Both references suggest the same location. The phrase he uses is the house by the channel. Westport has 2 channels. The eastern one is commercial. The western one is residential. She looked up. We find the residential properties on the western channel that fit the occupancy profile and we move. Cassian was already on the phone. Elena looked back out the window. The bay was visible now between buildings, flat, dark, the color of old iron. She looked at it and breathed through her nose and felt the particular sensation of a plan encountering reality, which is always different from the sensation of building a plan in a quiet room at 4 in the morning. The car stopped at a light. A woman crossed in front of them, pushing a stroller, unhurried, looking at her phone. Ordinary Tuesday morning. City with no idea. 7 properties, Cassian said, phone down. Western Channel, residential, private title. 3 are documented long-term owner-occupied. 4 have ownership structures that route through holding companies. He paused. 2 of those 4 have had utilities registered within the past 18 months. Address. He gave her both. She looked at them on the map his man sent through. One was at the north end of the channel, accessible from 2 main roads, easy egress in multiple directions. The other was at the south end, a peninsula position, water on 3 sides and a single road in. South end, she said. That's the harder one to leave. For us or for her? He looked at her. Both. She's not planning to leave in a hurry, Elena said. She's planned every element of this for 6 years. She's not in a property with good egress. She's in a property where she controls the approach. She looked at the map. South end, single road. She can see anyone coming from half a mile out. Which means she'll see us. Yes. Elena, she's supposed to see us. Elena folded the map and put it in the folder. That's the point. She sees us coming directly to her instead of to the facility, and she knows the protocol failed. She knows I understand the shape of it. And a person who has been in control of a situation for 6 years and suddenly isn't. She stopped. That person makes a move they haven't planned. Cassian was quiet for a moment. Or, he said carefully, a person who has been in control for 6 years and loses it does the most dangerous thing they've been holding in reserve. Elena looked at him. Yes, she said. That too. The light changed. The car moved. The road to the South Channel property ran through a neighborhood of narrow houses with small yards and boats on trailers in the driveways. And then the neighborhood thinned out, and it was just the road and the water on either side getting closer, and Elena felt the geography tighten around them, the way a corridor tightens. She saw the house from 300 yards. 2 stories, weathered gray siding, a dock extending into the channel on the south side. A single car parked on the gravel pad beside the house. Lights in the ground floor windows despite the daytime. Stop here, she said. The car stopped. They were at the point where the road curved and the house became visible. From here, anyone at a ground floor window with a clear line of sight could see them. She got out of the car. Cassian got out behind her. Elena. His voice was low and flat with the specific quality of controlled urgency. They already see us, she said without turning. We stopped being invisible the moment we turned onto this road. She straightened her coat. She had her folder under her arm. She had her mother's watch on her wrist. Still, always. Stay 3 steps behind me until I say otherwise. She heard him exhale. Then his footsteps on the road behind her, 3 steps back, and she was walking toward the house. The gravel was wet. The channel water on either side was very still. The cold came off it in a way that had texture, damp and metallic, the cold of a place where things are preserved by low temperature and low light. She was 15 feet from the front door when it opened. The man who stepped out was not Keel. He was larger than Keel, older, with the specific build of someone who has spent decades doing physical work that was not recreational. He had his arms at his sides, and he was looking at her with the expression of someone executing a role rather than making a decision. Ms. Voss, he said. I'm here to see Marlena, Elena said. She did not slow her walk. He put one hand up, not aggressively, just the universal gesture of stop. She stopped. She's expecting you, he said, which meant Marlena had seen them on the road, or had been told, or had simply known. All 3 were possible. She says to come in alone. Elena glanced back at Cassian. He was standing 3 steps behind her, his hands visible at his sides, his face doing nothing. She could see in the set of his jaw what it was costing him to stand still. She turned back. Fine, she said. Elena, Cassian's voice behind her. 3 steps, she said, without turning. Stay here. She walked past the large man and through the front door and into the house. The interior was warmer than the outside by a difference that registered immediately on the skin. Someone had been here long enough to heat it properly, not a temporary stay. The furniture was minimal and chosen for use rather than comfort. There was a table with papers, a laptop, a half-empty cup of something. There were no personal effects visible, no photographs, nothing that would identify the occupant to a stranger. Elena noted all of it in the 3 seconds it took to cross the entry and reach the main room. Marlena Voss was standing by the window that faced the channel. She was 61 years old, and she looked younger than that, not because she had tried to, but because she was the kind of person whose internal organization gave their face a structural integrity that age works around rather than through. She was smaller than Elena remembered, but the last time Elena had seen her she was 22, and Marlena had seemed enormous in the way that complicated adults seem enormous to young people who don't yet understand that size is largely about authority. She turned when Elena entered. She looked at her for a long moment. Her expression was not hostile. It was something Elena found, briefly, more difficult to process than hostility. It was recognizing. Familiar. The expression of someone looking at a person they have watched from a distance for a very long time. You came here, Marlena said, not to the facility. No. That wasn't in the model. I know. Marlena looked at her steadily. Sit down. I'll stand. A very small thing moved through Marlena's expression. Not quite a smile, but close. You sound like her, she said, when she dug in. Same posture. Elena felt the sentence land in her chest. She did not move. "Where's my mother?" she said. "Safe."
That's not what I asked. It's the answer I have for you right now. Elena looked at her aunt across the room.
The channel light coming through the window behind her, the papers on the table, the half-empty cup. She calculated the distance. She calculated the man at the front door. She calculated how much time she had before this conversation became something other than a conversation. "You've been watching me for 6 years," Elena said.
"Yes." "You arranged the marriage." Marlena did not answer immediately. "I identified Crosswell as an appropriate environment. I didn't arrange anything. You made your own choices."
Inside a controlled context. Most choices are made inside controlled contexts. People just don't usually know who's doing the controlling. "Why?" Elena said. "Why keep me in place? Why not just take the case?" "Because we didn't know where it was." For the first time, something in Marlena's voice shifted from its even register. "Your mother is precise about what she tells people and when. She gave you the case, and she did not tell anyone she had done it, not even me. We knew she had documentation. We knew it had to be physically preserved somewhere. We spent 3 years looking before we identified you as the likeliest recipient." She paused. "After that, yes. We watched. And waited for me to go to Cassian. We waited for circumstances to reach a point where going to Cassian was your logical choice. We helped those circumstances along, where necessary." The word we landed with a specific weight. Elena heard it clearly. "Who is M?" she said. Marlena looked at her without expression. "In Keel's messages," Elena said. "The correspondent, the one directing him. He called you M." She held Marlena's gaze. "But you're not M." Something changed in the room. It was not sound, not movement. It was atmospheric, the particular pressure shift of a moment that reorganizes. "No," Marlena said quietly. "I'm not." The door behind Elena opened. She turned. Rowan Keel walked in. He was carrying a flat metal case, olive green, latched, with a handle that had been repaired with tape at some point and never properly replaced. Elena recognized it with a physical jolt that traveled from her sternum outward. She had last seen it when she was 22 years old, packed among her mother's things, handed to her with the instruction to keep it safe and not open it. Keel set the case on the table without looking at Elena. "Flight landed on time," he said to Marlena. "Unit was secured 20 minutes ago." Elena looked at the case, then at Marlena. "He had a key." "We've had a key for 2 years," Marlena said. "We were waiting for the right moment to use it." "Then why—" Elena stopped. She ran the sequence backward. The protocol. The whole sequence with Cassian, with the rooftop, the files, the plane. "You didn't need me to go to the facility. You already had access." She felt something cold and exact moving through her mind. "You needed me to go to Cassian. You needed both of us moving toward each other in a way that was documented and visible." "Yes," Marlena said. "Why?" Marlena looked at Keel, then back at Elena. "Because the Aldrin contract," Marlena said, "is not a business arrangement. It's a transfer of organizational architecture. When it closes, Cassian Valerie's entire network structure, every partner, every channel, every protected route, becomes accessible to the Aldrin Group." She paused. "The Aldrin Group is ours." Elena stood very still. "We don't want to destroy him," Marlena said. "We want to absorb him. And the only way to do that without triggering the loyalty structures inside his organization is to do it with his willing participation." She looked at Elena with the direct clarity of someone stating a business proposition. "He won't do it for money. He won't do it for threat. But there is one thing Cassian Valeri has been unable to sufficiently rationalize for 11 years, which is the fact that he walked away from a building 6 years ago and left a woman behind who saved his life, and he has never fully forgiven himself for it." She paused. "You are the instrument. You walk in with him. You stand beside him at the close. And the organizational loyalty structures read it as endorsement, the partner's sign. And what your mother spent years building ends with a transfer rather than an exposure." Elena looked at her for a long time. The channel light was very flat and very cold. "And my mother," Elena said. "When the close happens, she's released. She goes home. Everyone moves forward." Marlena's voice had the quality of someone who genuinely believes they are describing a reasonable outcome. This doesn't have to be destructive. This is a negotiation. This is a hostage situation, Elena said. You're describing it in business language, but what you're saying is, do what we want or my mother stays in a room. Marlena said nothing. Where is she? Elena said again. Her voice was completely flat. Safe. Elena turned and walked to the table. She put her hand on the case. Keel moved. Fast, his hand closing on her wrist before she completed the motion, his grip hard enough to register as pain. She did not flinch. She looked at his hand on her wrist. She looked up at him. Let go, she said. He held for 2 seconds. Then he released. Her wrist throbbed with the specific heat of a grip applied too hard, too fast, and she did not look at it. She unlatched the case. Marlena said, Elena? She opened it. The contents were not what she expected. She had imagined financial records, organizational charts, the kind of documentation that reads like evidence because it is evidence. Instead, she was looking at a series of sealed envelopes, 12 of them, labeled in her mother's handwriting, dates on each. The oldest was 15 years old. The most recent was dated 3 weeks before her mother disappeared. She picked up the most recent one. Don't, Keel said. She opened it. It was a single page, dense handwriting, the particular compressed script her mother used when she was writing fast and thinking faster. Elena read it standing at the table with Marlena behind her and Keel beside her, and the channel light coming through the window and her heart beating so hard she could feel it in her back teeth. She read it to the end. She set it down. She turned. She looked at Marlena Voss, her mother's younger sister, the woman who had sent her a birthday card every year until she was 22, and then vanished from her life in what Elena had believed was fear for her safety. And she understood now, from a single page of her mother's handwriting, exactly why the case existed, and exactly what it contained, and exactly how much trouble Marlena was in, regardless of what Elena chose to do in the next 60 seconds. She documented you, Elena said. Not the organization, not the financial structures. You, specifically. Every contact, every communication, every decision you made from the point at which you were first approached by the Aldrin group. She held Marlena's gaze, including the approach itself, which she witnessed, which she recorded, which she authenticated with 3 independent witnesses whose identities are in the other envelopes. She paused. You didn't just take her to stop the exposure. You took her because she's the only person whose testimony would be believed over yours. Marlena's face did something complicated and brief. She knew you'd come for the case eventually, Elena said. She knew I'd open it when I understood what it was. She knew exactly what I would do when I read this. She picked up the page. She built this for the moment when you thought you had everything, and I could show you that you had nothing. Her voice was steady. Her hand was not. Where is she? The man from the front door appeared in the room's entrance. Behind him, Elena heard it before she saw it, there was movement. Not one person. Multiple. And then Cashin's voice outside, sharp and clear, with a specific edge that she had never heard from him before, but recognized immediately as the voice of a man who has run out of patience for strategies that keep him outside, while someone he cannot afford to lose is inside. Then the front window exploded inward. Not from a projectile, from Cassian's shoulder, because the front door was being held and the window was the next available option, and he came through it in a single motion that should not have worked as cleanly as it did, and yet did, because some people are built for exactly this kind of graceless necessary violence. He was bleeding from the forearm, where the glass had caught him. He did not appear to notice. He looked at Elena. She held up the page. I have it. He looked at Marlena. Something moved in his face that was older than anger, and quieter than it, and considerably more dangerous. Keel moved toward the table, toward the case, toward the envelopes. And Elena put herself between him and it, with a speed that surprised her, her body deciding before her mind completed the instruction, and Keel's hand connected with her shoulder and shoved hard enough that she went into the table edge and felt the impact in her ribs like a struck bell. She did not drop the page. Cassian crossed the room in 3 steps, and his fist connected with Keel's jaw with the blunt efficiency of someone who is not performing violence but simply committing it, and Keel went sideways into the wall and stayed there. The room was very loud for 3 seconds, then very quiet. Elena straightened. Her ribs screamed. She breathed through it. 1 breath, 2, her hand flat on the table, the page still in her grip. She looked at Marlena, who had not moved from the window, who was looking at the room around her with the expression of a person watching a controlled situation become uncontrolled and trying to identify the exact moment it had turned.
Elena knew the moment. It was when she opened the envelope. Her mother had always understood the right moment for things. She looked at Marlena and she said very quietly, so that the words had to cross the full width of the room to reach her.
"You are going to take me to her right now. You're going to get in that car outside and drive, and I'm going to be in the back seat, and Cassian is going to be in the front, and you are going to take us directly there, without stops, without calls, without signals of any kind." She held up the page. "Because every other envelope in that case is going to a specific person in the next 6 hours, unless I stop it, and I will only stop it if she is standing in front of me unharmed before tonight." Marlena looked at her. Outside, through the broken window, the channel was flat and dark, and the cold came through in a rush that mixed with the smell of glass dust and old wood and the copper smell of Cassian's blood from his forearm. 6 hours, Marlena said. 5 now, Elena said. Marlena looked at the case, at the envelopes, at the page in Elena's hand. She looked at Keel against the wall, coming back to consciousness with the disoriented deliberateness of someone whose body is running a restart sequence. She looked at Elena. Elena looked back. She was breathing hard. She could feel her ribs with every breath in a way that would be significant later and was manageable now. Her mother's watch was on her wrist and still and cold against her skin. And she held the page with both hands and stood at the table in a gray waterfront house in a city she had once lived in quietly and invisibly, and waited for her aunt to make the only decision that had any remaining logic to it. Marlena reached into her jacket pocket and removed a phone. She made a single call, 12 seconds. She said 4 words that Elena did not catch because the blood in her ears was too loud. She lowered the phone. 1 hour, Marlena said. The location is 40 minutes from here. Elena nodded. She began replacing the envelopes in the case, one by one, in order. She latched it. She picked it up. She looked at Cassian. I was watching her with his bleeding arm and his unreadable face, and she held his gaze for exactly long enough to communicate what needed to be communicated, which was, I'm all right, keep your position, we're not done. He gave the smallest possible nod. She turned toward the door. Elena, Marlena said. She stopped. She did not turn. She talked about you, Marlena said. Her voice had changed, lost something, or found something. It was hard to say which. Every time I saw her, even after, she talked about you. Elena stood with her hand on the door frame and the case in her other hand, and the cold coming through the broken window and her ribs hurting with every breath, and she did not say anything for a long moment. Then she said, I know. That's why I'm giving you the 1 hour instead of walking out of here right now. She went through the door. Outside, the channel was the same flat dark it had been when she arrived, and the gravel was wet, and the cold was the cold of a place where things are preserved by low temperature. And Elena Voss walked to the car and got in and set the case on her lap, and held it with both hands and breathed through the pain in her ribs, and waited for the hour to begin. The drive took 38 minutes. Elena counted them. Not deliberately. It was the kind of counting that happens below the level of intention, the body marking time because the mind is too occupied with other things to tell it to stop. She sat in the back seat with the case on her lap and her hands flat on its surface and watched the city fall away through the rear window, the gray buildings thinning out into industrial corridors, and then into the flat coastal scrubland that runs along the western edge of the bay, low vegetation and salt-bleached fencing, and the occasional structure that looks like it was built for function and never reconsidered. Marlena was beside her, not speaking, looking at the road ahead through the windshield with the expression of a person who has run their calculations to the end and found an answer they are still in the process of accepting. Cassian was in the front passenger seat. His forearm had been wrapped with something from the car's kit, a field dressing, efficient and graceless. He had refused to look at it for the first 10 minutes, and then looked at it once, and then looked back at the road. His jaw was set in a way that indicated pain being managed by the same mechanism that manages everything else, will, and the understanding that the alternative to managing it is not acceptable. The driver was one of Cassian's men. He drove without commentary and without any visible response to the atmosphere in the vehicle, which Elena respected. She looked at the case under her hands. She thought about her mother writing that last letter 3 weeks before she disappeared, writing it fast, in the compressed script she used when she was thinking fast. With the knowledge, it had to be knowledge, not suspicion, that what was coming soon. Writing it anyway, latching the case, handing it to a 22-year-old daughter and saying, "Keep this safe, keep it closed," with the particular tone of instruction that is also, when you understand it later, love in its most functional form. Her ribs hurt with each breath. Not unbearable. The kind of hurt that teaches you how to breathe more economically, shallower, more deliberate, the body adapting to constraint the way it always does. She thought about Damien, briefly. She had not thought about him in hours and found, examining the fact of him in her mind, that he had already receded to a specific distance, not gone, not irrelevant, but no longer the foreground of anything. He was part of the architecture of what had happened without being the cause of any of it, and there was something almost sad in that, if she had the bandwidth for sad, which she currently did not. "There," Marlena said. The driver had already seen it. He was slowing. The structure was not a house. It had been, at some point, 2 stories, square, built from the same gray-weathered materials as everything else in this coastal strip, but it had been converted into something more institutional over time. The windows smaller than residential windows. The ground floor fitted with what looked like external access controls that were inconsistent with the rest of the structure's age. 1 car outside. No visible personnel. "How many inside?" Cassian said. His voice was level, which Elena understood required effort. 2, Marlena said. "They've been told to expect us." "Told when?" "On the call." "The forward call." Marlena looked at the back of his head. "Yes." Cassian looked at the driver. The driver looked at him. Something passed between them in the economy of men who have been in situations with bad geometry before. Elena opened the car door and got out before anyone instructed otherwise. The wind off the bay was immediate and total. The kind of wind that doesn't blow so much as simply exist. A permanent condition of the geography. It pushed her coat flat against her front and lifted her hair, and she held the case against her body with both arms and walked toward the building. She heard the car doors behind her. She did not turn. The front access control was a panel beside a steel-reinforced door. She stopped in front of it. She looked at it. She heard Marlena's footsteps on the gravel behind her, and then Marlena was beside her, and Marlena pressed a sequence into the panel with the practiced automaticity of something done many times, and the door opened. The interior was warmer than outside, like the Channel House, the same recent habitation warmth. There was a corridor, institutional lighting, and at the end of the corridor a man who fit the same profile as the man from the Channel House. Large, professional, executing a role. He looked at Marlena, then at Elena, then at Cassian behind her. He stepped to one side. "End of the hall," Marlena said. "Left." Elena walked. The corridor was short. 6 doors, 3 on each side, all closed. She counted them without deciding to. At the end, she turned left, and there was a single door, and she stopped in front of it and put her hand on the handle. She stood there for 4 seconds. Then she opened the door. The room was small, and it had a window, real light, not artificial, facing east away from the bay, and the morning was coming through it in the way late November morning comes through windows in places close to water, pale and specific and without warmth but present. There was a bed, a chair, a table with books on it, and a woman sitting in the chair beside the window with a book open on her lap, who looked up when the door opened and for 1 second did not move. Elena had been preparing herself on some level for her mother to look destroyed, for what 6 years of involuntary captivity does to a person, which she had imagined in the fragmented, unwilling way you imagine things you cannot afford to imagine fully. She had prepared for damage, physical, visible, the kind that cannot be concealed by composure. Sylvia Voss looked at her daughter and closed the book on her lap, with the deliberate care of someone who has spent 6 years treating every object in a room with the respect due to things that will outlast their circumstances. And she stood up from the chair, and she was thinner than Elena remembered, and her hair was entirely gray where it had been half gray 6 years ago, and there were new lines around her eyes and her mouth, and she was standing on her own 2 feet in the morning light, and she was looking at Elena with an expression that undid every piece of composure Elena had assembled over the preceding 48 hours in a single quiet instant. Elena crossed the room. She did not run. She walked because her ribs would not permit running, and because some things are too large for the speed of running. They require the full weight of each step. Her mother's arms came around her. They stood there in the small room with the pale morning coming through the east window, and Elena's face against her mother's shoulder, and neither of them saying anything, because there was nothing that language was the right instrument for in that moment. Elena felt the thinness of her mother's shoulders under her hands, the specific thinness of a person who has been in one room for 6 years and fed adequately but not well, and has slept and woken and slept again for 2,000 days in a space no larger than this one. She felt it with the particular anguish of understanding that is worse than imagining, because imagining allows for revision and understanding does not. She breathed through her ribs. She held on. After a long time, her mother pulled back. She held Elena's face in both hands, the gesture of a person checking something, confirming something. And she looked at her with the specific quality of attention that Elena had spent 6 years quietly missing without allowing herself to name what she was missing. "You opened it," her mother said. "Yes." "The last letter?" "Yes." "You understood it?" "Yes." Elena's voice was steady with effort. "I understood all of it." Her mother looked at her for another moment. Then she looked past Elena, at the door, at the corridor beyond it, and then at Marlena, who had appeared in the doorway and was standing there with her hands at her sides and her face doing something that Elena did not have the capacity to interpret right now, and was not sure she would ever have the capacity to interpret. Sylvia looked at her sister for a long time. "You should come in," she said. Her voice was very quiet and entirely without anger, which was the thing that hit hardest. Not the anger that Elena had expected, but the exhausted recognition of something that had been processed over 6 years into a form that no longer resembled what it started as. "If you're going to be here, come in." Marlena stepped into the room. She stopped 3 feet from the door and looked at her sister and said nothing. She was doing the thing that people do when they have constructed extensive justifications for something over a long period and are suddenly in the same room as the person those justifications were constructed to keep at a distance, and the justifications, in proximity, reveal their actual texture. "The contract closes in 2 weeks," Sylvia said. Not to Marlena, to the room. "Everything you built that timeline around, it's already shifted." She looked at her sister. "You know that." "It can be adjusted." "It can't." Sylvia sat back down in the chair, not from weakness, but from the considered decision of someone choosing their position. "Elena has the documentation. Cassian knows the structure. The Aldrin partners are going to start receiving information tonight, regardless of what happens in this room." She looked at Marlena steadily. "It's over, Marlena." "You don't know it. I know you." Sylvia's voice did not rise. "I've known you for 60 years. I know what you look like when you've run out of runway." She paused. "Come sit down." Marlena did not sit down. She stood in the middle of the room with her hands at her sides and her face doing the complicated, brief, difficult thing it had been doing since Elena opened the letter, and Elena watched her from beside her mother's chair and felt something she had not expected to feel in this room, which was not satisfaction and not relief, but something closer to grief. The specific grief of watching someone who had a different choice available to them at some point arrive at the end of a road they selected a long time ago. "Why Cassian?" Elena said. Marlena looked at her. "Out of everyone you could have used, you chose to root it through him." Elena held her gaze. "You knew what he was to me, or what that night 6 years ago was. You knew, and you built the architecture around it anyway." She paused. "Why?" Marlena was quiet for a moment. The wind outside pressed against the east window and the pale light moved slightly on the floor. "Because it was the one variable I was certain would function as designed," she said. "Everything else in a plan like this has tolerance. People deviate, circumstances shift, but some things are fixed. Some things are too fundamental to a person's nature to deviate." She looked at Elena. "You saved his life. He never stopped owing you that. I needed a force that would bring you out of your silence without coercion, because coercion would have made you a different kind of threat." She paused. "I needed you to move willingly." "And I did." "Yes. Until I didn't." Marlena said nothing. "The thing about using someone's nature as a mechanism," Elena said, "is that their nature includes the parts you didn't model." She looked at her aunt. "You modeled my loyalty, my caution, my willingness to move toward the people I trust." She held the case against her body. You didn't model what happens when someone has nothing left to protect. From the doorway, Cassian said, "The Aldrin partners have already been contacted." They all looked at him. He was standing in the doorframe with his wrapped forearm and his jacket open and his phone in his hand, and his voice had the quality of a man reporting a fact rather than making a threat. 2 hours ago, he said, I made calls on the plane before we landed, before I knew exactly what we were walking into. He looked at Marlena. Because the first thing you do when you think someone might be ahead of you on every move is make the move they can't intercept retroactively. Marlena closed her eyes, briefly, then opened them. The close is off, Cassian said. The Aldrin Group will receive a full disclosure package by end of business today. Their counsel will advise withdrawal within 48 hours once they understand the liability structure. He paused. Whatever you built this for, it's done. The room was quiet except for the wind. Elena looked at her mother. Sylvia was watching Marlena with the expression that had replaced anger over 6 years. The exhausted, clear-eyed recognition of a person who has had nothing to do for a very long time but understand the situation she is in. Marlena, Sylvia said. Her sister looked at her. You have to stop, Sylvia said. Simply, not as a command. As a statement of fact delivered by someone who has been waiting a long time to say it in person. You have to stop now. Marlena stood in the room with the pale light and the wind outside, and her sister's eyes on her, and something happened in her face that Elena would think about for a long time afterward. Not a collapse. Nothing so dramatic as that. More like the settling of something that had been held in tension for a very long time, the release of a pressure that had been so constant it had become indistinguishable from the person maintaining it. She sat down on the edge of the bed. She put her hands in her lap. She did not say anything. The next 4 hours were logistical in the way that the aftermath of things is always logistical, the infrastructure of consequence requiring attention, regardless of the emotional weight of what produced it. Cassian made calls. His people made calls. The documentation in the case was photographed, authenticated, and transmitted to 3 separate legal entities before the afternoon was out. The 2 men in the building were removed by Cassian's team without incident. They were employees, not principals, and the distinction mattered for what came after. Elena sat with her mother in the small room while all of this happened around them, and they talked. Not about everything. There was too much for everything, and the room was too small and the afternoon too short for everything. They talked about specific things. Her mother's 6 years in the room, which she described with the factual brevity of someone who has already done the emotional work of those years and is now simply reporting them. Elena's 6 years in Crestfall, which she described with similar brevity and which her mother listened to with the focused attention that Elena recognized from childhood as the attention of someone who is storing everything to process later. They talked about the case. Her mother explained what each envelope contained, in order. 14 years of documentation assembled with the same compressed methodical care as the last letter. Names, dates, transactions, testimony. The full architecture of a betrayal that had begun not with the Aldrin Group, but much earlier. Before Elena was born, in a moment of decision her mother had watched her sister make and recorded because she understood even then that the moment would be needed later. You knew, Elena said, that early. I suspected that early, her mother said. I knew later, but once I suspected, I started writing things down. That's all it was. At the beginning, writing things down. She looked at her hands. It became a habit. Elena thought about her own notebooks. The first one she had started in the 4th year of her marriage, writing down observations in the careful, specific way that had become, she now understood, entirely native to her. Not a skill she had developed, but something older than that, something she had absorbed without knowing she was absorbing it. You taught me that, Elena said. Her mother looked at her. I didn't know I was teaching you anything. You were. Elena looked at her hands. I just didn't know I was learning it. They sat with that for a moment. The light through the east window had shifted from morning pale to the flat gray of afternoon, and the wind had picked up off the bay. And somewhere in the building, the sound of Cassian's voice moved through a wall and then moved on. He's a good man, her mother said. Elena looked at her. I know who he is, her mother said. I've had nothing to do for 6 years but read and think and piece together what I could of what was happening outside. I know what he built. I know what he did and didn't do. She paused. I also know what you said to him when you were 22, in a building neither of you should have been in. You know? Marlena had transcripts. Her mother's voice was dry with the weariness of someone who has lived inside the specificity of another person's surveillance for a long time. She kept everything. She thought information was the same as power. A pause. Sometimes it is. But she never understood that the information you keep from someone and the information you give to them are different instruments. Elena thought about Cassian on the rooftop, placing his coat over her shoulders. She thought about him coming through a window because a door was being held. She thought about him in the front seat of a car with a field dressing on his arm, making calls 2 hours before they needed to be made, because thinking ahead was the form his care took. She thought about a question he had asked her on a plane over white cloud cover, which was whether she was sure, and the fact that she had said yes in the particular tone of performance and certainty being the same instrument, and the fact that he had known the difference and had made the calls anyway. He's complicated, Elena said. So are you, her mother said. That's not an objection. That's a description. Damien Crosswell received the first indication of what had happened not through his investigator, not through Fletcher, but through a news notification on his phone at 6:47 in the evening. A financial wire service item about the Aldrin Group's withdrawal from an undisclosed acquisition arrangement, citing due diligence findings. He read it 3 times. He was in his office on the 31st floor with the city lights coming on below him in the early dark, and he sat in his chair with the phone in his hand and the notification on the screen and the slow, cold understanding arriving like weather that had been forecast for days. Fletcher came in 20 minutes later. He looked at Damien. He looked at the phone. She did it, Damien said. Not a question. Appears so. She had the documentation. Yes. Damien set the phone down. He looked out the window at the lights. He had spent 30 years building those lights. Not literally, but in the way a man builds a city around himself, using money and connection and the particular ambition that comes from believing, at the foundational level, that what matters is the accumulation of things that signal importance. I had her for 7 years, he said. Fletcher said nothing. She lived in my house. She sat across from me at dinner. She came to my events. He stopped. I thought she was quiet. I thought she was ordinary. He looked at the lights. I thought I was doing her a favor. Damien, I know. He did know. The knowing had been arriving in pieces since this morning on the courthouse steps, accelerating through the helicopter and the background check and the investigator's urgent flag. And now here it was in its complete form, the full shape of a mistake that was not really a mistake but a choice, made consistently over 7 years. The choice to see someone as smaller than they were because it was convenient. I know what I did. What do you want to do about it? He looked at the lights for a long time. Nothing, he said. There's nothing to do about it. He picked up his glass and looked at it and set it down again without drinking. She's already done everything. Fletcher sat down across from him. They sat in the quiet of the 31st floor with the city spread out below them, and Damien Crosswell did something he could not remember doing since he was very young, which was to sit with the full weight of a thing he had done without immediately reaching for a mechanism to address it. It was heavier than he expected. He had thought, for 7 years, that Elena's quietness was absence. He understood now that it was the opposite, that the quietness of a person who is always paying attention is the most complete form of presence, and he had spent 7 years in close proximity to it without once looking directly at it. He would not get that back. The 7 years, the proximity, the chance to have seen clearly what was there. He had had a woman in his house who could dismantle a 6-year conspiracy from a hotel room in 48 hours, and he had looked at her and seen furniture. He did not say this to Fletcher. There was no version of saying it that would have done anything useful. He said, "Send her something." Fletcher looked at him. "Not an apology. She doesn't need my apology." He thought about it. "There's a building on Carver Street I've been holding for rezoning, mixed use. It was supposed to be part of the Aldrin positioning." He paused. "Sign it to her. Fair market transfer. No conditions." "Damien, it won't fix anything. I know that." He looked at the lights. "I just want there to be something that shows I understood, eventually. Even if she never uses it. Even if she never acknowledges it." He stopped. "Even if she never knows it came from understanding and not from guilt." Fletcher looked at him for a moment. Then he wrote something in his phone. I'll arrange it. They sat in the quiet for a while longer. Elena's mother left the building just after 4 in the afternoon, in a car Cassian had arranged, with 2 of his people and a destination she had chosen herself. A city 3 hours north where she had, it emerged, maintained a property and a name no one knew about, not even Marlena. She had planned for the eventuality of being released the same way she had planned for the eventuality of being taken, because Sylvia Voss had been planning for eventualities since before Elena was born, and the habit was not one that imprisonment interrupted. Elena stood in the gravel outside the building and watched the car go. She stood there for a while after the car disappeared. Cassian came and stood beside her. He did not say anything. He had that quality she had noticed in him 6 years ago, in a back room with a wound in his side. The quality of knowing when presence is what's needed and when words diminish it. The bay was visible from here, at this distance, in the low angle of the late afternoon, a line of dark water at the edge of the land, and above it the sky that was doing what November skies do in the late afternoon, moving through gray into the deeper gray that precedes dark without any of the drama of a proper sunset. Marlena, Elena said, she'll be remanded to her own legal counsel tonight. The documentation goes to 3 jurisdictions in the morning. He paused. It won't be fast. These things aren't fast. No. But it will be complete. Elena nodded. Her ribs had stiffened during the 4 hours inside. The body's administration of injury, the inflammation arriving on its own timeline regardless of what else was happening. She would need to have it looked at. She would do that later. Heal, she said. Handled. She looked at him. He had documentation he thought would protect him, Cassian said. It doesn't. He made the mistake of believing that information retained is always more valuable than information released. It isn't. He paused. He'll cooperate in exchange for what he imagines is consideration. The consideration will be less than he imagines. Elena looked back at the water. The Aldrin contract, she said. Dead. As of this afternoon. You lose a significant yes. And the organizational exposure from Keel's communications will require 6 months to manage properly. He said it without visible distress. I know. She looked at him. You knew that when you made the calls on the plane. Yes. You did it anyway. He looked at the water. I told you on the rooftop I was sorry it took me this long. The calls were the first thing I could do that was concrete. He paused. I'm not good at the other kind of thing. What other kind? He was quiet for a moment. Saying things, he said. Clearly. Without a plan attached. Elena looked at the side of his face. The light was going now, the gray deepening, and the wind off the bay was cold enough that she could feel it in the injury in her ribs. And she thought about what her mother had said in the small room. That he was a good man, which her mother had assessed from 6 years of captive analysis and reading and thinking, and which Elena was assessing from a different set of evidence over a different kind of time. You came through a window, she said. The door was being held. You came through a window with glass in your arm and blood running into your sleeve. I was aware of that, yes. And you didn't say anything about it for 4 hours. There were more important things happening. Elena looked at him. Cassian. He looked at her. That's the other kind of thing, she said. What you just described. Saying it clearly. He held her gaze. Something in his face did the brief, complicated movement she had been watching for 2 days. The movement of a man who has been operating in environments where clarity is a liability for so long that the muscle for it has atrophied, trying to find it again. Yes, he said. I suppose it is. The dark was coming in off the water. The gravel under their feet was wet and gray. Behind them, the building was being closed down efficiently by Cassian's people, and the sounds of that, doors, vehicles, voices giving and receiving information, created a practical background to the particular quiet between them. I'm not the same person I was 6 years ago, Elena said. The one you left in that building. I know. And you're not the same person either. No. I don't know what that means yet, she said. For what comes next? I don't know the shape of it. Neither do I. She looked at the water. That's an unusual thing for you to admit. Yes. A pause. It's an unusual situation. She felt something move through her that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to it. The specific warmth of recognition, of being in the presence of someone who speaks a language close enough to your own that translation is not required. She had felt it the first time she met him, in that back room, cleaning a wound with inadequate materials while he stayed conscious through sheer refusal, and she had set it aside then because the timing was what it was, and she had set it aside again for 6 years because the geography was what it was, and it was still there. That was, she thought, either very good or very complicated, probably both.
I see.
3 weeks later, in a city that was not Crestfall and not Westport, Elena sat in a coffee shop on a street she had not yet memorized and opened the second of her remaining notebooks, the one she had kept, the one that was not left in the cab, to a fresh page. She wrote the date at the top. She wrote her mother's name below it. Then a question mark. Then the phone number she now called every morning at 9, which her mother answered on the second ring, always, the way some people answer a particular call, with the specific promptness of someone who has thought about the ringing before it happens and is already ready. She wrote a list, not of grievances or observations or the careful cataloging of another person's behavior. A list of things she was going to build. A consultancy, using the skills she had never formally named, that had no official credential behind them, but had just dismantled a 6-year conspiracy and disrupted a major financial acquisition, which she thought was credential enough. She had 2 tentative conversations already, initiated by people who had watched what happened to the Aldrin contract and drawn their own conclusions about the intelligence that had driven it. The conversations were careful and indirect because the world she was operating in was careful and indirect by nature. She was comfortable with careful and indirect. She was also, she was discovering, comfortable with other things she had not expected to be comfortable with. Cassian was in the same city, not by coincidence and not as arrangement. She had been clear about what she wanted, which was her own apartment and her own timeline and her own pace for figuring out the shape of things. And he had been, to his credit, clear about what he wanted, which was proximity and patience, which were also apparently the only 2 things he was willing to say clearly. They had dinner twice a week, sometimes 3 times. She did not count the times carefully because she had decided, deliberately, to stop counting some things. Her ribs had healed. 3 weeks, which the doctor had said was on the faster end of normal. She breathed now without the reminder, which she had noticed the moment it stopped. The way you notice the absence of a persistent sound more acutely than its presence. She wrote 3 more items on the list. The building on Carver Street had arrived via legal transfer 4 days ago. She had known it was from Damien before she opened the paperwork, not because of anything explicit, but because the gesture had a specific quality that she recognized as the kind of thing a person does when they understand something too late and are trying to make a record of it. She did not call him. She did not send a response. She filed the paperwork and engaged an architect and made a decision about what the building would become, which was something that provided a service to people who needed it. The specifics she was still working out, but the direction was clear. She did not forgive Damien in the sense of the word that suggests absolution. She had thought about it, actually thought about it, the way she thought about everything, with method and without sentimentality, and decided that forgiveness was the wrong category for what was required. What was required was the recognition that a person who could not see her clearly was not seeing her clearly, and that this was information about them and not about her, and that she had spent 7 years absorbing it as information about her, and that she was done with that. She was done with a great many things and beginning a great many others, and the proportion felt for the first time in a long time like the right ratio. Her phone buzzed, her mother's name. She picked up before the second ring. "You're early," Elena said. "I've been rereading the 3rd envelope," her mother said. "I want to talk through the timeline before we send it to the second council. I have 30 minutes before my next meeting." 30 minutes is enough. A pause. "How are your ribs?" "Healed." "And the other things?" Elena looked out the coffee shop window at the street she had not yet memorized, at the people moving along it in their ordinary morning trajectories, at the city that did not know her name and had no opinion about what she had been, or what she had cost anyone, or what she had survived. "Healing," she said, "on a longer timeline." "That's correct," her mother said, with the particular tone of a woman who has processed 6 years in a room into something that resembles, from a certain angle, hard-won equanimity. "That's how that one works." They talked for 30 minutes. They went through the timeline. They were precise and methodical, and occasionally they said things that were not about the timeline at all, that were about the specific texture of being alive after a period of being held in stasis. And those parts of the conversation were shorter and quieter and more important than the rest. When they hung up, Elena set the phone on the table and looked at the notebook and the list and the date at the top of the page. She picked up the pen. She wrote one more line at the bottom of the list, separate from the others, without a practical outcome attached to it. Just a statement, the kind her mother had taught her to make by making them herself, in compressed handwriting, in a room with a window for 6 years, because writing things down was how you held on to the shape of yourself when everything outside the room was trying to revise it. The line said, "I was here. I knew what I was worth. I did not let anyone else decide." She looked at it for a moment. Then she closed the notebook, finished her coffee, and went out into the street that she had not yet memorized but was beginning to learn, in the way you learn things when you have time and intention and the specific kind of patience that is not passive but active, the patience of someone who has stopped waiting for the right moment and started building it, one morning at a time, from whatever materials are available. The city moved around her. Ordinary. Indifferent. Loud. She moved through it with the particular quality of a woman who has stopped trying to be invisible and started trying to be precisely and completely herself, and found, to her own careful and ongoing surprise, that these were not as different as she had feared. The woman everyone thought was, nobody walked into the morning with her notebook under her arm and her mother's watch on her wrist. Still not working, still worn, still the weight of something chosen and kept. And she did not look back at the coffee shop window, or at the city she had left, or at the version of herself that had walked out of a courthouse 31 days ago with a broken suitcase wheel and $42,000 and everything she needed already inside her. She looked forward. She had a meeting to get to.